The room has considerably been brightened by the presence of Debbie Matthews, who joins us in studio this afternoon. Hello, Debbie.
Hello, Matt Murphy.
How you doing?
I'm so good. Good to see you.
I like your sweater that you've got on. I don't know that anyone can see that on Super Talk TV right now, but it's nice. It shows off your icky black heart.
Yes, it's a big black heart right in the center. That's right. I am a dark soul. No, I'm not. I'm shiny happy, but I'm pissed about some things. There's
a lot of dark souls going on right now, considering Washington, D.C. and what's going on around the country. So I so appreciate you being here.
Well, I love my WTN folks. I love you and appreciate you. And when I called and said, hey, we've got a big event in the Conservative Republicans of Murray County on Monday night, the 22nd. You know, we've got a January 6th prisoner's wife here that is coming to speak. Love to have her on the show. Thank you, Matt, for
Well, it's our pleasure to have her, and she is a voice and a name perhaps that is familiar to those of you who listen to Super Talk on a regular basis, whether it's Nashville's Morning News with Dan Mandis or Chris Hand. She is Saray MCabee. She is the wife of Ronald MCabee, who is a former Williamson County deputy who was convicted this past October of 5 felonies for his role in the January 6th issues surrounding and involving the United States Capitol. And Sarah joins us in studio. Hey, Sarah.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's a privilege to have you. It's a privilege to talk with you, and I appreciate your willingness. It's got to be a painful retelling of events that led to your husband's incarceration and his continued incarceration, but I appreciate you putting a spotlight on what's going on in Washington, D.C. and around the country. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Do you consider what is happening to your husband political persecution?
Absolutely.
Okay. I thought so, and I do as well. But I want to start at the beginning for those who perhaps have not heard the story. And I just want to let you kind of lay the story out there without any interruption by me. Tell us what led, let's start here, what led to Ronald, does he go by Ronald?
Colton.
Colton? Okay, very good. That's why I asked. What led Colton to want to be at the Capitol or in Washington on January 6th?
Yeah, so of course the stolen election of November, he was really upset about that. And he was talking to a friend about going, who had already gone to the November protest in Washington, D.C. And so he was planning on going on January 6th. And my husband had been in a car accident just 9 days prior. So he was in no shape or form to go. But in a marriage, you know, you pick and choose your battles. And so I trusted at the time this friend to take care of him. And he had every right to be in Washington, D.C. that day to air his grievances with the government. And so he went to Washington, D.C. with his friend, and they went to the speech that morning. I truly believe that he didn't know what was about to unfold because I don't think he would ever went to the Capitol knowing what was already going on down there. And he went down there with his friend, and they met at the Peace Circle, and there wasn't as much chaos breaking out at the time, but there was just waves of violence that was happening, and there was just a sea of so many people. And he saw the gentleman get shot. Matthew Black got shot with a rubber bullet in his cheek. And him being a first responder, he was trying to, calm the crowd and all of that. Well, he found himself at the Lower West Terrace Tunnel around a little bit before 4:30 in the afternoon. And that's really where the violence was happening with the police officers. And as he's made his way up there, just simply because there was no turning around. I mean, you're in a sea of people when you look at the footage. And so he made his way up there. And as he was up there, they had already cleared the tunnel because it was full of people. And then the police line had cleared the tunnel out. They had sprayed OC spray and pushing people out of this tunnel. So there was a mass pileup of people down there. And there was a woman who had collapsed in his arms that he pulled up from the ground. And then that's when he looked at the ground, and there was a police officer lying on the ground. And him being a law enforcement officer, he went to aid this police officer. As he's trying to aid this police officer, he sees Lila Morris beating Roseanne Boylan off to the left. And so he's communicating with these police officers. I'm one of you. I'm helping you. He gets hit by a police officer. He's assaulted first by this police officer, another one. And he just shoves him open-handedly, shoves him to create space. What he's taught to do as a law enforcement officer, says, I'm helping. And he goes to help this police officer, and they slide down the stairs together because another protester was pulling his leg. And he's down over top of him. He's on his hands and his knees, protecting him. He's telling the crowd, no, quit, stop. The police officer says, "Get off me." He says, "I'm one of you. I'm helping you." The officer says, I know. Help me up." Rolls him over to his side, gets him back to the line of duty, goes to try to resuscitate Roseanne Boylan. They decide that him and a group of protesters decide to pick up her body, move it back to the police line. She was turning blue. She needed medical attention. He starts to give her chest compressions as they drag her body away. And the crowd kind of disperses. He's the only one standing there, and they spray him with pepper spray. And he's like, "I'm not hurting anybody. Stop spraying me." He's literally standing there by himself up against the brick wall. And a third officer that watched this entire thing go down thanked him twice on video for his help. Mm-hmm. And the crowd surges up. They're really upset about what just happened with Roseanne. And this officer who thanked him puts his arm around him and says, "I got you, man. I got you." 7 minutes of his life. He has now been incarcerated for 29 months.
Solitary confinement.
A lot. Well, obviously, there's a lot to unpack in the aftermath of January 6th, and a lot to unpack what you just said. Do you communicate? Do you have the ability to communicate with Colton?
Yes.
How often are you able to talk with him?
At least once a day, depending on if they have open communication.
How's he doing?
That's a loaded question. Honestly, it's a one day at a time thing. I truly believe it's only by the grace of God that these guys are still standing, 3 years later, after all the persecution that they have been through at the hands of their own government.
Mm-hmm.
We have talked several times, but they didn't let him trim his nails, have a shower.
Yeah, it was really bad in Washington, D.C. When they first got there. So for 2 years, they were not allowed haircuts. They were not allowed to clip their nails. They were not allowed to have chapel. They were not allowed to leave the pod. They weren't even allowed visitation, nor video visits, because they didn't have that system implemented. So for 2 years, not only were they in the fight of their life with the federal government for January 6th, they were actively being hidden from their families. Spouses couldn't see their loved ones. They didn't get to see their children. Their mail was tampered with. They literally were trying to hide them from the world. They were trying to get them to shut up.
It's difficult to conceive of how our justice system has been perverted in the political execution of what they're trying to do, which is pretty obvious to those of us who are observing what's going on. But I want to try to establish a baseline because we don't know each other, and I've never had the pleasure of meeting your husband. Do you and or Colton accept that he made mistakes on January 6th?
That's he
did swing at an officer.
No. So
I saw the video, though, Sarah.
Yeah, no, he pushed him away after the officer assaulted him.
Well, no, and I'm not trying to turn your husband into the bad guy. I'm just trying to establish some. The officer came up to him as he's standing over this. He's not even hurting this officer. But he pleaded guilty, didn't he?
Yes, because that technically, if you're looking at the law, officers are above the law. So they are allowed to beat you, and you're not allowed to protect yourself. You're not allowed to even say self-defense or defense of a third party.
No, I disagree with that, but go ahead.
I don't think cops should be above the law.
I agree with that.
If they attack you, as a law enforcement officer, you're taught to create space between you and the threat. And at that time, the person who attacked him was a threat. And so all he simply did was put his hands up on him to create that space.
Right. And if he was that police officer and somebody put hands on him as a deputy of Williamson County, he would take that as a threat and he would respond
accordingly. Sure, but after he did that officer didn't do anything because he said, "I'm one of you. I'm helping you."
I'm not trying to argue. Yeah. I'm not trying to get in the weeds on it.
Sure.
I'm just trying to establish if, looking back on this, Colton recognizes that he could have made decisions that day that would not have put him in a position to be falsely accused of felonies.
To be honest with you, I think if it would happen tomorrow and he knew what was coming, he still would have done the same thing because that's what he's taught to do. There was an officer that was down that the crowd was trying to get to, and he stood in the way from the crowd to that officer, and he tried to save a woman's life. I think anybody would have done that. Any man of dignity, and especially anybody, law enforcement, whether you're on duty or off duty, you're taught to run into action while other people are running away. So what I saw in that 7 minutes of video footage, I saw an officer in action. And he's communicating. He's not just throwing his hands around and creating chaos. He's trying to be the calm in the chaos. And he's communicating with the officers. I'm one of you. I'm helping you. You have a man down.
Right. Those officers, does he look at them now as bad actors?
No, what this has proven is that the Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police, those two agencies are untrained. They should have never been in the position that they were in that day, but they certainly are supposed to be taught techniques, escalation techniques. And what they were doing to that crowd, that's not how you get a crowd to calm down.
Didn't the police officer that was down that your husband helped testify on behalf of your husband?
He testified, but the officer that thanked him testified on behalf of him.
Okay.
So what was he initially? Was he initially charged with 5 felonies?
Yes.
And why did he make the decision in your communication? Why the decision to plead guilty to some of these?
It was the 111A, and that was when he pushed the officer away, because technically in the eyes of the law, that you're not allowed to touch an officer. I personally, as a citizen and a law enforcement officer, wife of 7 years, don't believe that should be a law. Officers shouldn't be above the law. They should be held accountable for their actions.
Wait, so you believe that citizens should be allowed to lay their hands on police officers?
I think they're allowed to protect themselves. If an officer attacks you, you should be allowed to protect yourself.
Okay. And Colton felt he was being attacked.
He was hit with a baton by Carter Moore.
Right. So I'm just, once again, I believe, and I wasn't there, but I believe that I would recognize advancing on those stairs would be putting myself in a bad position, particularly when, as you just said, the officers had just cleared a tunnel and they were attempting to clear the stairway.
So that officer that was down on the ground, Andrew Waite, was in harm's way. So you wouldn't insert yourself to try and help him, who was on the ground. He was defenseless. Right.
So in order to do that, and you know more about this situation, I'm just learning.
Yes.
Right. I'm just learning. Your husband felt like he was the one in position to assist the officer as opposed to the other officers on the scene.
Well, he said you have a man down, and they didn't do anything.
So he felt like he should insert himself in that situation.
100%. He gave them the opportunity to help this officer, and they didn't. Another officer had just went down the stairs. Blake Miller had just went down the stairs seconds prior, and they didn't do anything to help him.
Now, my take on what has happened on January 6th, pulling out 50,000 feet, is that I think it was a tinderbox exacerbated by the fact that the officials on the scene, including Nancy Pelosi, who was in charge of security, did not provide proper security for the Capitol at the time. And there was some level of infiltration amongst the crowd with federal officials, and that led to an ignition of that tinderbox, and it led to people doing things that they probably wouldn't have done under normal circumstances, and it led people to do illegal things on the Capitol grounds. Broadly, do you see it that way? I mean, I know you're very, very close to the forest, so it's difficult to see the trees.
Yeah. No, I think if you want to look at the violence that happened that day, because there absolutely were bad actors in the crowd. Good people did bad things, reacting to things around them. But if you want to pick out the violent versus nonviolent, and you look at what those waves of violence were, look at what happened minutes prior to all the violence breaking out. So in his particular case, Roseanne Boylan was murdered by a police officer right in front of their eyes. She was clubbed to death. And the police officers did nothing about it. The protesters were trying to save her life. Well, 30 minutes before that, inside the tunnel, Captain Bagshaw beat a woman 40 times and punched her in the face and beat her with a baton, Victoria White, who was a January 6th defendant who is now serving her time. She was beaten by the police officers. So elderly and women were being beaten. That's why American patriots were so upset at the police officers that day.
You believe that they were upset because of the violence that they saw in that secure area?
Yeah, because there's a woman who is down on the ground.
Well, but there was also a recognition, or was there a recognition that they had breached a secure area?
No, because how can you trespass if you don't know you're trespassing? They were not inside. The snow fencing that they had up was gone.
I'm not arguing that your husband should be in jail. Okay? I'm arguing I believe that your husband should be at home right now. Okay? But I would push back on this concept that people aren't aware that they can't walk at their desire into the United States Capitol.
They weren't inside.
They were on Capitol grounds, and the Capitol Police were telling them to exit the property, right?
Whoever said they said to exit? So they had snow fencing up.
Hey, once again, I don't want to argue about particulars necessarily, but I mean, for me, it's a common sense situation where if there are groups of officers that are demanding that we disperse from the area that we're currently in, that your husband would be aware.
Sure, if they said that.
And they didn't.
No. And it was so loud that day that they had
sirens.
So
your argument is your husband was not aware that he was in an area that he should not be.
Sure, if you want to argue that, slap him with a trespassing charge and give him a misdemeanor and a fine for everybody that day. But how do you know you're in a secure location if there's no signs that you're trespassing? If the snow fencing is already gone, police officers are letting people inside and they're not telling you to leave.
I mean, I would think that your husband would be better able to recognize a breach of a perimeter than most anybody on that property that day based on his training.
If there was a perimeter.
Oh, there was a perimeter. I mean,
it was gone by the time that they got there. Most of them, because it was already breached while the speech was still going on at the Ellipse.
And once again, I don't want to get caught in the particular details, but I mean, I recognized the misdemeanor. I mean, from my take, there were some misdemeanors that were breached.
Sure.
There were trespassing that was breached. If you want to argue that it was a disruption of lawful assembly, that's fine too. What is happening, and more broadly, what I'm concerned with is the political nature of the persecution that happened to your husband and others in the aftermath of the day's events. Do you believe you got a fair trial?
No. How can you have a fair trial when the judge, every person that sits on the jury pool, the prosecution, and most of the defense attorneys are named victims in the case?
Right.
Every person that was in Washington, D.C. on that day are named victims in these cases, yet those are the people that are deciding the fate. And there's been no change of venues granted.
Let's talk about that your husband requested bond, and he was able to come in front of a Tennessee judge, Judge Frensley, and he granted him bond to be released. And D.C. immediately appealed that, correct? Mm-hmm. And then sent him back or didn't release him, so he had no bond.
Correct. Because he was apprehended in Tennessee, he went in front of the Middle District of Tennessee, Judge Frensley. And after several back and forths, different reasons to recess, he was granted bond pending trial. Yet the government didn't like that. And so they immediately appealed it, and it went in front of a D.C. judge who they knew they were going to keep him.
All right. Everybody's mad at me. Everybody's mad at me.
They should be mad.
Everybody's mad at me. I know. Everybody's mad at me. Everybody's mad.
No. Wait a second.
No. Hold on.
The thing is, the first question I asked her when she was on our radio show is, did you want to beat your husband's ass or not? Because that's the first thing as a wife going, what the hell have you gotten yourself into? And why are we in this predicament right now? However.
Everybody's upset at me.
But 2 weeks ago, we had a Palestinian riot to promote Palestine. There was violence, and they occupied a building, and there was not one arrest.
Look, everybody's mad at me for questioning Sarah in the way that I am. Are you mad at me?
No.
Okay,
I appreciate this dialogue.
Well, look, I think it's important.
My story's been my same story.
I'm just trying to learn.
No, I don't believe my husband did anything wrong. I believe it could have happened at the Tennessee State Capitol. It could have happened in a Chick-fil-A parking lot. He ran into action. He saw an officer down, and he tried to save a woman's life. I think any law enforcement officer or any man of dignity would have done the same thing. It just happened to be on January 6th at the U.S. Capitol.
Let me just give you some examples of what I'm dealing with. Let me just give you some examples of what I'm dealing with. Tread lightly, Matt. You're coming across as an ass. Beta thinking is backing the blue. You're such a loyalist. Your husband was a police officer, right?
Yeah.
He is a police officer.
Mm-hmm, right. Which blue am I backing here? You're way off target. You're an ass. You're claiming you're not trying to convict her husband. I'm not trying to convict anybody. I'm just trying to figure out if Sarah believes that Colton did anything wrong. That was it. That was all I was trying to figure out. It's 1:25 on Super Talk 99.7 WTN. We'll be back in a moment. Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Thank you for being with us. Debbie Matthews is in the house with us. Also, Saray MCabee, who is wife of Colton MCabee, who remains in custody in Washington, D.C. Debbie was asking a question moments ago, and we've only got about a minute in this segment, but we have another one after the bottom of the hour. But how in the world is it that Colton has not been offered an opportunity for bail or to be able to be home in the interim between the time that he was charged with these crimes and arrested and the time that he went on trial? It seems, I mean, I understand the trial happened in October, but it seems pretty ridiculous that he was not allowed to be home with his family.
So Judge Frensley, Middle District of Tennessee, granted him bond after we went into recess twice prior to that in September of 2021. The government immediately appealed that. It went in front of Emmett Sullivan in Washington, D.C., where he said no.
Why?
No bond.
Why?
They said he was a danger to the community, but Judge Frensley here...
He's a sheriff's deputy.
Well, that's what Judge Frensley said. He said, okay, so he's never had a strike on his record. He's been a law enforcement officer for 7 years. You knew about him for 90 days. And you didn't apprehend him. You watched him at his house. You watched him at work. You watched his wife. You didn't pick him up for going through a red light, for rolling through a stop sign. You waited 2 weeks after you had an arrest warrant to raid his house. And now you're trying to tell me he's a danger to the community? There's no way. I'm not believing it. But in Washington, D.C., they are all victims of this, and they are judged by a day on the calendar versus their actions that day.
Well, regardless of whether our whatever precipitated the events that led to what happened on January 6th, what's happened in the aftermath has been an absolute travesty of justice. Let's talk about that in a moment and what is next for your husband and for your family right after this. We got a quick timeout. Debbie Matthews and Saray MCabee in studio with us. It's Matt Murphy and Super Talk 99.7 WTN. Super Talk 99.7 WTN 136. Matt Murphy with Saray MCabee, who is the wife of Colton MCabee, who remains incarcerated in Washington, D.C., wrongly so, in my estimation. And Debbie Matthews is also with us. I don't mean to put you third fiddle there, Debbie.
Oh, no. No, you always put me first fiddle, and I appreciate that. And thank you for letting us come in today. We are having a January 6th prisoner's wife tonight at the Memorial Building at 6 o'clock. Yeah. The conservative Republicans want her to tell her story, and it's specifically about what has taken place since January 7th and on, because we are watching a two-tiered justice system that is occurring right now. And not that we don't want people held accountable for their actions on January 6th. We just want people to be treated. There were no real arrests, incarcerations, or anything regarding the summer of the burning of 2020. Even this past couple of weeks, we've had people that have occupied a building and have been violent out in front of the White House. There was not one arrest. So we just have two tiers of how things are going down in this country, and we need to talk about it.
Well, and here's the deal. On January 6th, a group of people engaged in such a way where they were accused of certain things. Those groups of people are being treated differently than Antifa, BLM, any of these other groups of people, which has created a dynamic by which a lot of folks believe that none of the people on the property at the U.S. Capitol did anything wrong.
And that is incorrect.
And that's not right. Now, I mean, I understand. I mean, and I just was trying to establish a baseline for Saray as to what happened to her husband, what she feel like he did, what was done to him, why was he there, and we did that. And his primary role and his primary goal on the steps during the moments of the altercation, which was videoed, was to try to calm the. And this is what I did see. I saw somebody that understood, for whatever reason, that the Capitol Police were doing what they were doing. I think he could probably put himself in their mind space better than anybody else there that day. And I think he was trying to be a dividing line, saying, hey, there are no, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but there are no bad people here. Let's everybody calm down and get people medical attention that need medical attention, et cetera. Is that fair?
Sure.
Bottom line is, he is still in jail. He was never offered an opportunity to get out of jail, as you just mentioned moments ago. And he was convicted this past October. Were you at the trial?
I was.
Give me your thoughts about what you saw and what you experienced.
So you saw things happen in the trial that you would never see in other places outside of Washington, D.C. as jurors, just the same 14. We went through 70 and got down to 14. Our victims, in the case, as I mentioned earlier, named victims. So if you went and robbed a bank, those hostages would never decide your fate. The judge would never decide your fate in that. But that's what's happening. And they're being judged by a day on the calendar versus their actions that day because there's already a predetermined verdict. When you look at the cases of January 6th, there's a 99.6 conviction rate. Mm-hmm. The Department of Justice usually only has about a 60% conviction rate. But January 6th, it's just a whole different ballgame. But the thing that the prosecution was allowed to get away with on several occasions, but this one was a big one. They sent back evidence to the deliberation room that was never submitted into trial. So immediately that should have been a mistrial, except for the judge was like, well, I'm going to ask the jury if they can look past it. Can you unsee what you saw?
Right.
And of course they all sat there and said yes. And then an hour later came back in and convicted him of every charge.
Is there are we in the midst of an appeal? Is there an opportunity to appeal?
Yes, we can appeal, but we have to wait until after he's sentenced on February 29th. Do you mind if I address your audience?
Yeah, sure.
I want people to know, Matt, you're not a bad person. You have valid questions. But wait, no, there were bad things that happened on January 6th. There were good people that were set up. There were good people that got caught up in the moment and did bad things. However, those people that are charged, there needs to be accountability across the board. You can't charge some and not all. But they shouldn't be overcharged and overpunished. That is the problem.
Now, and I will say this, that when Sarah and I were talking, when we had the extent, I don't know what people are so upset about, but I expect more out of someone who has gone through the rigors of police officer training than your average Joe citizen. And so when I was pressing back, it was based on your husband's training and recognizing that those people across the line from him were trained to do a certain thing too, and they were told to do a certain thing too. Your response was valid in as much as he wanted to get help to people who had just been hurt. That was your response, and that makes sense to me. So my question was asked and answered.
Sure.
So, I mean, and that's fine, whatever. I mean, people are mad at me for asking questions. That's fine. I don't mind that at all. Because I recognize that even amongst the people, not your husband, but even amongst the people that did things that perhaps they regret or perhaps they even should be charged for, those are political pawns too. Every person on the campus of the United States Capitol on January 6th has become a political pawn with regard to a persecution to further a narrative that it was a, quote, insurrection that day. Did your husband ever speak to you about any of that in the aftermath of the charges against him and his arrest, that he somehow, a man that had sworn to uphold the law, was somehow being accused of attempting to incite rebellion against the United States of America?
Here's the thing that a lot of people don't understand. There were little to no weapons there that day. You're not allowed to carry a weapon in Washington, D.C., yet you have the most armed people. Patriots are the most armed people in America. Going to Washington, D.C., if they wanted to overtake the Capitol and they wanted to overtake the government, they absolutely would have. It was just, if that's the way that people look at it, they should sit there and laugh. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. How can you go and have an insurrection with no weapons?
No, it makes no sense to me. I mean, well, and it is an attempt to create a narrative that doesn't exist.
Sure.
And it's also an attempt to basically say, hey, America, don't even try this, because this is what is going to happen to you. If you try to stand up, if something is not right, this is an example of set your butt down, don't even try this. I asked Sarah when she was on our radio show, because you know I do a radio show, 3 Dudes with a View, which triggers liberals midway between Graceland and Dollywood every day of the week. But she was on our show, and I looked at her and I said, you know, I'm scared. Maybe I'm a little scared to talk to you about this. I don't want to be in a bucket where somebody's looking at me. But I need to know, have they come down on you in other ways? Has the IRS harassed you? And what about your bank? And you said that the bank debanked you, correct?
They did.
Why?
Because my husband was on the account. That's the thing. These people, until October of 2023, he was only charged. He was not convicted of anything. He was just being held, and he was charged. But it didn't matter. He had already been deemed a domestic terrorist. Right. They are literally on TSA. Anybody that was in the vicinity of Washington, D.C., January 3rd to January 7th. You could have been there for a work conference. You could have been there for a funeral. You could have just had a layover at one of their 3 airports, not even that being your final destination. You will forever be on a watch list.
Unless, apparently, it was you that was laying phony pipe bombs at the DNC.
Yeah, then they don't know who you are.
They got no clue who you are or what you were doing.
Right.
I mean, that has to be a frustrating aspect of this, too. That there's cherry picking even amongst the blanket accusations of terrorism and insurrection and rebellion. Then they cherry pick amongst those individuals. Ray Epps is one of those individuals that's been cherry picked. His name became such a focus that they finally saw fit to push that a little bit further, although I don't think that.
He got a really light sentence last week, I think. But she was debanked. There were also other apps that don't let you. I think Airbnb doesn't allow you, correct?
They canceled me.
I have several people wanting to know if you're willing to name the bank so that they know where not to bank.
Bank of America.
So you got debanked by Bank of America.
That's ironic.
Battle for the win.
Land of the free, home of the brave.
They didn't just debank me. They withheld my money. So they would take my deposits, but they wouldn't pay out any of my bills, and they wouldn't let me go to the bank and withdraw any money.
Why not?
Because he's deemed a domestic terrorist. And so I had power of attorney. I had everything. I had to get an attorney involved to get my money out of the bank to pay my bills.
So this is like civil asset forfeiture. You had to go to a court to prove your innocence.
Well, it gets even better because Airbnb, they canceled me because I'm associated with him. They not only canceled him, but when I was like, why is my account not working? They sent me a news article, mind you, and said, because you are associated with this man, you will never be able to have an account with us again.
What was the lady's name we had on whose parents were canceled because of her?
I was remembering that story, and I was wondering if I was remembering Sarah's story as told by someone else.
This is the second time we've heard this.
This is the second time that we've heard this, that she had an association with someone that was deemed quote unquote undesirable. What the hell? What is this country coming to?
I want to go back to the cherry picking. So not only do they cherry pick on a big scale, they cherry picked in my husband's case because the man that he went with is now an informant for the government, and they waited until after trial to give him misdemeanors. But he's the one who drove. He's the one who paid for everything. He had weapons on him. He was fist fighting with the police officers, and that's what he was wanted for on the FBI wanted list. But instead, my husband's sitting in jail.
Wait, did your husband know this guy?
Yes, we were friends.
And so this guy turned state's evidence in order to get a sweetheart deal? Is that your estimate? I mean, that's what you can figure out, or do you know that? Or
yeah, that's what we figured out. So they're cherry picking on top of cherry picking because they wanted to go after him because I believe that's why they held him on bond, is because he witnessed Roseanne Boylan being murdered and he was a police officer.
That is exactly.
I was about to say, I think the fact that your husband, that Colton is a police officer, I think that has, I don't know, I'm speculating here, but it seems to me that they're going after him harder. Even
because
more
he witnessed a murder.
Because he witnessed something like that and has the gravitas to perhaps testify and do something about what he saw.
Sure, because the FBI even went to the agencies that he had worked for, including Williamson County, and told them that they are not allowed to speak to me or speak to him. Clearly, they can't speak to him. But nobody within that agency will answer the phone, will answer any questions as to why they won't say anything, why they won't even give a character reference on behalf of him, because the FBI went to them and told them to shut up.
How is your husband holding up?
One day at a time. There's good days and there's bad days, but when you're thrown into a hot box for 29 going on 30 months, and you've just had your whole life destroyed in front of you, it's a very roller coaster thing.
What do you expect that will come out of February 29th, which is the day that he's sentenced?
To be honest with you, I don't know, because the government's going to ask for 14 to 17 years.
What?
Yes.
For what?
Because they can.
I mean, and for those that don't know, I mean, in the build up to the police officer, the Capitol police officer falling, I mean, and there can, you can see what's on the video. There's a lot of things going on. There's an incredible amount going on in the video. And we kind of went over that at the beginning. But here's what was clear to me when I watched it, that your husband is creating something of a protective shell over that police officer at the point that he recognized that whatever happened before then, it appears to me, watching the video, that your husband recognized this dude's in trouble.
Yeah.
And I need to help him right now. And that's when he yelled no to the crowd, telling the crowd to get back. Is he being accused of attempting to assault or harm that? I mean, he was charged with that, right?
Every time he went to pick up that officer, they charged him with assault.
When he was trying to pick him up to help him.
Yes.
And so he's facing 14 to 16 years.
The government's going to ask for 14 to 17 years.
What is the best case scenario to
Time
come out of the 29th? That he gets to go home?
Sure.
And if that's not the case, are you prepared, or can we help in any way, offer our assistance to help with an appellate process?
Yeah, so right after the 29th, we are able to go through the appeals process.
Right.
So give your website of what you're doing now with your foundation to help other political prisoners.
So throughout this horrific mess, we realized that there were things not being met. One, for visitation. They weren't able to see their loved ones for 2 years, and then they couldn't financially afford for them to see it. So we funded visitation. But then on the flip side is we had a private attorney, and I had a very well-known attorney in D.C. look at me and said, Sarah, what are you doing? You've paid so much money, and he's still sitting in jail. You haven't even gone to trial. You're going to have to pay even more money. Fire your private attorneys, get a public defender, because he's going to be found guilty if he goes to trial in Washington, D.C., and then hire an appellate attorney. And so, unfortunately, these families did what everybody thinks you're supposed to do and go get the best attorney that you can get and pay whatever you need to pay. There's a 99.6 conviction rate, so it doesn't matter what kind of attorney you have. And so now they're literally sitting there serving their time because they don't have the money for an appellate attorney.
So you've started a foundation.
Yes, Stand in the Gap is our foundation, standinthegap.foundation, and we help January 6 defendants and their families.
How many Colton MCabees are there out there, in your estimation?
Very few. I do know that there are other people that, in my eyes, I believe are innocent, but a lot of the people, there's almost 1,300 individuals charged across America. Out of those 1,300, it's definitely only a handful of the people that are truly innocent of the charges against them. But the other people are overcharged and overpunished. Yeah,
I mean, and that's what gets convoluted to folks who are looking at this. It's hard to look at this with any sense other than the politics have taken over the justice.
The process is the punishment in this, for sure. You don't ever hear about people waiting without bond for 3 years without trials.
It's ridiculous.
You don't ever hear about charges like this, a 99.6 conviction rate, a plea deal. They offered him a plea deal for 7 to 10 years.
I don't understand, and maybe I'm just ignorant. I don't understand why it's taken. Why the gap in sentencing? I mean,
again, it's never heard of. It's never heard of. Their speedy trial clocks have been stopped.
Right. I mean, the guilty verdict happened in October, right?
Yes.
October, November, December, January. I mean, 5 months between a verdict and a sentence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, it makes no sense.
And that was the soonest time. It wasn't like the sentencing was pushed back. That's what was decided on October 11th was February 29th.
And so you have to sit in jail for that length of time in addition to
So tonight at the Conservative Republicans meeting
at
the Memorial Building in Columbia, Tennessee, Sarah is joining us tonight, and we are showing the video in conjunction with everything so everybody can see what all went on. But what's really interesting is that the video audio, which you heard, where you heard him say no to the crowd, etc., was not played during his trial. The audio was not allowed to be played by the prosecution did not play the audio.
Why not?
So in the bond hearing, the audio wasn't played, and Why? Because it completely goes against the narrative of what the prosecution wants. You look at it without the audio and you're like, this is very chaotic. But then you turn on the audio and he's communicating with the officers. So in the bond hearing, it wasn't played at all. And in the trial, the prosecution never played it. Either video didn't have any audio, it was sped up, or it was slowed down. So the defense had to get the audio in there.
Did they?
Yes. But it doesn't matter.
I mean, jury trial in D.C., it doesn't matter. You're right. Once again, give us the way that people can contact you and could support your husband.
Standinthegap.foundation.
And you, Debbie, once again, tonight
at the Memorial Building in Columbia, the Conservative Republicans of Murray County is hosting Sarah to show her that there are people willing to listen. All we want is justice and equal justice under the law. And we want to hear about what's going on. But we believe that this is the hottest topic in the country right now. And we do believe that there's a two-tier justice system that is going on. If you are BLM, Antifa, or even a Palestinian rioter, you're not getting arrested. You can do whatever you want.
You can call for genocide on every college campus in America.
You can do whatever you want. But patriots, tax-paying citizens that work for a living, if they stand up and say something's not right, something smells stinky here, and they use their ability to assemble and to protest, oh, no.
Final thought. I know that you hope and pray, and I do too, that Colton is home long before November of 2024 or January of 2025. But what are your thoughts about, Trump has intimated that he will right some of these wrongs. Is that the ultimate hope?
For
Should
sure.
it come to that?
Yeah, for sure. That's the ultimate hope. But 2020 wasn't fixed. 2022 wasn't fixed. Why do we think that nothing's going to happen in 2024? We're just going to win by a landslide. That's not true. But even a blanket pardon, this isn't going to go away because there needs to be true investigations. Why? We just heard that the January 6th Select Committee deleted evidence, yet people are sitting in jail and convicted of crimes for deleting text messages.
Well, and the whole DNC thing, which I'm going to get into in the 2 o'clock hour, is just egregious too, because now we realize that the FBI the authorities on the scene that day knew that there was no threat, and they allowed that narrative to continue. Sarah, we've got to go. We've got to leave it there. Thank you for being on with us.
Thank you.
It's been an incredibly compelling hour. Debbie, as always.
Thank you, Matt.
I love your black icky heart, as in reference to her sweater, not her actual black icky heart.
Your dogs and everybody's good at your
Everybody's
house?
wonderful.
Awesome.
Everybody's awesome.
Good to see you.
Sarah, thank you.
Thank you.
Here's Saray MCabee, wife of Colton MCabee, and Debbie Matthews. Back in a moment on Super Talk.